A local Indiana newspaper reported last week that a 10-year-old rape victim was denied abortion access in Ohio just 3 days after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which forced her to seek care outside of the state. Now, this story instantly went viral online, and it actually made its way all the way to the White House.
Just last week, it was reported that a 10-year-old girl was a rape victim in Ohio. 10 years old. And she was forced to have to travel out of the state to Indiana to seek to terminate the presidency and maybe save her life. That's last part is my judgment. 10 years old. 10 years old. Raped, 6 weeks pregnant, already traumatized, was forced to travel to another state. Imagine being that little girl. I'm serious. Just imagine being that little girl, 10 years old.
A recent analysis, however, from the Washington Post now calls into question details of the Indianapolis Star's reporting, considering only one source is attributed for the story, abortion doctor Caitlin Bernard. According to the Washington Post, it's not evident that the Star made any kind of fact check on Bernard's account. We want to get into what else is fishy about the reporting with culture editor at the Federalist and co-host of Rising Fridays, Emily Jashinsky. She joins us now. Welcome, Emily. What's going on right now?
Italy.
Sorry, I just got back from France and feeling very cosmopolitan today.
It was sort of like a Biden moment, because did you hear in the clip where Biden, he's in the zone. He's like giving this very impassioned speech and says, terminate the presidency.
I heard that. I heard it.
Yikes.
But look, in all seriousness, what's going on with this story? How did this manage to get all the way to the White House with so little fact checking?
You know, that's one of the things that, in a sense, it's a great illustration of what happens, because this came out of the Indy Star, which is a very reputable major newspaper. It's not, the local paper or whatever, it's the Indy Star. And so the White House said they took that report, and because it was in the paper, that's how it ended up snowballing into this major story. But I think Philip Wegman, when he had his question at the briefing last week and asked, have you made any attempts to contact this victim? And the White House said no, they had no answer to that question. It gets to, how real did anybody think this story is? And to be very clear, there are two different conversations. One, there's a conversation about whether the story is representative of something very serious that is going to happen in the post-Roe landscape. And the second element of it, though, is how did this get printed? And the thing that's shocking, if you look at it, is there's a single source, one source. That source in and of herself is an abortion provider. I don't know if she's a doctor, but I think she is an abortion doctor. She's all over the media. She's constantly talking to the press. She works with Planned Parenthood. And I believe she's currently in a lawsuit against the state of Indiana. So you have the interests of her right there. And also the paper doesn't seem to have checked with law enforcement. And that's one of those things that a reader or the White House should assume that the paper did. The AG just told Fox News last night that there's literally no record of this happening. There is no record, according to both states, of whether this has ever happened in the state. And there would be if something like this almost certainly would be if something like this had actually happened. So the newspaper should have done it. Then the White House should have done it. But you can see you're supposed to be able to trust the newspaper to have already done the due diligence. So I actually understand how that happened.
Well, right. So this is an interesting journalism issue because they did. It's not the biggest screw up ever, because they did. Caitlin Bernard, the abortion doctor, or gynecologist, or whatever kind of medical doctor she is. She is on the record. So she did this. It's not anonymously sourced. She said. But what she said in the story is that I heard of this happening from someone else. So she did not have any interaction with the alleged 10-year-old, but she heard from another. So this is according to the Washington Post fact check of it, that Caitlin Bernard, who performs abortions, received a call from a child abuse doctor in Ohio who had a 10-year-old patient who was 6 weeks and 3 days pregnant. So she says she heard it from someone else. Given that is the and then she's the only source. So she is named, but she doesn't have any knowledge of this. She doesn't have it's already at her level, it's not a primary source. Yeah. It's secondary source. So I think, given that being the reality, it was on them to check it additionally, which, as you said, they clearly didn't do. And then now the Washington Post tried to verified that the 10-year-old exists and couldn't do it. And they made significant effort to try to find the person. They contacted law enforcement. They contacted clinics. They could not produce this person. So
this wasn't also part of the story that when you have a minor who's pregnant, there are certain reporting guidelines that the doctors have to take because they were obviously raped. It's statutory rape, and then they have to then go and provoke the follow-up investigation from a legal perspective, right? And that's part of why it was so suspicious, why there's no crumbs here that leads back to the victim. And I will say, look, I understand kind of relying on a news report from a reputable paper from the perspective of the White House. I kind of understand, or from the perspective of others who were talking about this story, taking it at face value. But there does also seem to me to be something a little bit untoward about the White House using this story rhetorically to make a point about abortion without caring enough about the victim to have investigated, to even try to help her.
That's a great point.
Right? Like, if this is really this terrible thing, which if it were true or is true, it is obviously a horrible thing.
Right.
And you have the power of the presidency, wouldn't you have wanted to reach out to give aid and intervene on this child's behalf? That should have triggered the knowledge that this may not have been a legitimate story.
I think that's why Philip's question was so smart, because that's the real way to get at this. I mean, how sincere is this concern if you are not going to check in and see what happened? I mean, even to, of course, try to check in with the individual, check in with the state, check in with law enforcement. Have they provided resources? Is everybody okay? I mean, the White House has staff to do that. And you'd think that they would if the story was more than just a point in a speech to them. And that's not necessarily on the president, although you'd think if he reads something like that, as the president, he would immediately marshal resources to help deal with it. But speechwriters, everyone, nobody thought. So I think that's another extremely important point of this. But it does get to, like, you cannot trust newspapers right now. Like, this is an old school newspaper. They did not do the basic due diligence, and this one got caught because it turned into a really high profile thing when the White House used it, but they did not do the basic due diligence. They local news has been hurt so much by technological changes. They don't have the layers of editorial control and fact checking that they used to. But even as a reporter, even if you reported and edited and published this story yourself, you would check in with law enforcement. It is obvious.
To that point, I want to read the last paragraph of this Washington Post fact check, which again was a good and worthy fact check because they tried to corroborate and then were honest about the fact that they really couldn't. But then so the Washington Post article ends with this. This is the bottom line. This is a very difficult story to check. Bernard is on the record, but obtaining documents or other confirmation is all but impossible without details that would identify the locality where the rape occurred. And then here's the weird part. With news reports around the globe and now a presidential imprimatur, however, the story has acquired the status of a fact, no matter its provenance. If a rapist is ever charged, the fact finally would have more solid grounding. What on earth did they mean by that? That it's a fact because people have said it was a fact?
I think what he's trying to get to is the way that, like, media and social media creates, nobody reads the correction, right? So, like, even if there was a correction on this story, it has gone around the world a million times, and average readers don't have the time that we do to consume every little tidbit of news on Twitter. And so they see the original story for the most part. And sometimes, if they pay attention to conservative media or alternative media, watch shows like this, they find out that it was wrong. But otherwise, people see something, they hear something horrible from the president, it's excerpted on the nightly news, and they really believe it. And that's an incredible disservice to the people that you work for. If you're a journalist, you work for your news consumers, you work for your readers, and it is just an awful lack of standards to respect them enough to do the due diligence.
Yeah, we saw this with the Haitian whip story at the border. I mean, there are people who still talk about the whipping, and what really frustrates me as a leftist is that oftentimes the underlying thing described is bad without the embellishment. There's already plenty of true bad things that you could be talking about all the time, but when you do things like this, it really undermines your case. So I would just caution folks on both sides of the aisle. Obviously, there's a lot of people who believe a lot of facts that are incorrect about the Trump, in the election and who stole what and all of this other kind of thing. Like, this is happening everywhere. And so I understand the impulse for information czars and everything, but what people like Glenn Greenwald have been pushing back against is that it is not a partisan issue. These kinds of stories happen, misleading good faith news consumers on both sides of the aisle all the time. And it really puts us in a difficult position to trust each other and have good faith conversations going forward. But, thank you so much, Emily, for joining us today.
Of course, that was very well said. Agree with every word.
And we will have more Rising for you after this.